As we start to come now to our communion part, I want to read out to you something I've read many times. It's a doctor's report of the cross. And as their worship group keeps singing behind me, as we remember this, that we know that Jesus was risen again, that we remember what happened before that, as we read of all that he did. The preparations for Jesus' scourging were carried out at Caesar's orders. The prisoner was stripped of his clothing and his hands tied to a post above his head. The Roman legionnaires stepped forward with the flagrum in their hand, and this was a short whip consisting of several heavy leather thongs with two small balls of lead attached at each end. The heavy whip was brought down with full force again and again across Jesus' shoulders, back and legs. At first, the weight's thongs cut through the skin only, and then as the blows continued, they cut deeper into the subcutaneous tissues, producing first an oozing of blood from his capillaries and veins of the skins, and finally spurting arterial bleeding from the vessels and the underlying muscles. The small balls of the lead first produced large, deep bruises and were broken open by subsequential blows. Finally, the skin of the back was hanging in long ribbons, and the entire area was unrecognizable, a mass of torn, bleeding tissue. And when it was determined by the centurion in charge that the prisoner was near death, the beating was finally stopped. The half-fainting Jesus was then untied and allowed to slump to the stone pavement, wet with his own blood. They threw a robe across his shoulders and placed a thick stick in his hand for a scepter. Small flexible branches covered with long thorns, commonly used for kindling fires in the charcoal braziers in the courtyard, were plated into shapes of a crude crown. And the crown was pressed into his scalp, and again there was copious amounts of bleeding as the thorns pierced the very vascular tissue. After mocking him and striking him across the face, the soldiers took the stick from his hand and struck him across the head, driving the thorns deeper into his scalp. Finally, they tired of their sadistic sport and tore the robe from his back. The robe had already become adhered to the clots of blood and the serum in his wounds, and its removal, just as in the careless removal of a surgical bandage, caused excruciating pain. The wounds again began to bleed. The heavy patibulum of the cross was tied across his shoulders, and the procession of the condemned Christ and two thieves and the execution detail of Roman soldiers headed by a centurion began its slow journey along the route. In spite of efforts of Jesus to walk erect, the weight of the wooden beam, together with the shock produced by the amount of loss of blood, was too much. He stumbled and fell, and the rough wood of the beam gouged into the lacerated skin and muscles of the shoulders. He tried to rise, but human muscles had been pushed beyond their endurance. The centurions, anxious to proceed with the crucifixion, selected a stalwart man, Simon of Cyrene, to carry the cross, and Jesus followed, still bleeding and sweating the cold, clammy sweat of shock. And the 650-yard journey from the fortress Antonia to Golgotha was finally complete. The prisoner was again stripped of his clothing, all except for a loincloth which allowed the Jews, and the crucifixion began. Jesus was offered wine with myrrh, a mild analgesic. Pain-relieving mixture. He refused the drink. Simon was ordered to place the patilium on the ground, and Jesus was quickly thrown backwards, with his shoulders against the wood. The legionnaire felt for the depression at the front of his wrist. He drove a heavy square wrought iron nail through his wrist and deep into the wood. Quickly he moved to the other side and repeated the action, being careful not to pull the arms too tightly, but to allow some flexion and movement. The patibulum was then lifted into place at the top of the stipes, and the title read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. The left foot was pressed backwards against the right, with both feet extended and toes down. A nail was driven through the arch of each, leaving the knees moderately flexed. The victim was now crucified. As Jesus slowly sagged down with more weight on the nails in the wrist, excruciating fiery pain shot along the fingers and up the arms to explode in the brain. The nails in the wrist were putting pressure on the median nerve. Large nerve trunks which traversed the mid-wrist and hand. As he pushed himself upwards to avoid this stretching torment, he placed the full weight on the nail that had gone through his feet. And again there was searing agony as the nail tore through the nerves beyond the metatarsal bones of his feet. At this point, another phenomenon occurred. As the arms fatigued, great waves of cramps swept over his muscles, knotting them in deep, relentless, throbbing pain. With these cramps came the inability to push himself upwards. Hanging by the arm, the pectoral muscles, the large muscles of the chest were paralyzed, and the intercostal muscles, the small muscles between the ribs, were unable to act. Air could be drawn into the lungs, but it could not be exhaled. Jesus fought to raise himself in order to get even one short breath. Finally, the carbon dioxide level increased in the lungs and in the bloodstream, and the cramps finally subsided. Spasmodically, he would be able to push himself upwards to exhale and bring in life-giving oxygen. It was undoubtedly during these periods that he uttered short sentences that are recorded. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. To the thief, today you shall be with me in paradise. And to the crowd, my God, why have you forsaken me? He suffered hours of limitless pain, cycles of twisting, joint-rendering cramps, intermittent, partial asphyxiation, and searing pain as tissue was torn from his lacerated back from the movement up and down against the rough timbers of the cross. Then another agony began, a deep crushing pain in the chest as his pericardium, the sac surrounding the heart, slowly filled with serum and began to compress the heart. The prophecy in Psalm 22, verse 14 was being fulfilled. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted in the midst of my bowels. The end was rapidly approaching. The loss of tissue fluids had reached a critical level. The compressed heart was struggling to pump heavy, thick, sluggish blood to the tissues, and the tortured lungs were making a frantic effort to inhale small gulps of air. The markedly dehydrated tissues sent their flood of stimuli to the brain, and Jesus gasped. A sponge soaked in posca, the cheap sour wine that was the staple drink of the Roman legionnaires, was lifted to Jesus' lips. His body was now in extremis. He could feel the chill of death creeping through his tissues. This realization brought forth his words, possibly little more than a tortured whisper. It is finished. His mission of atonement had been completed. Finally, he could allow his body to die. With one last surge of strength, he once again pressed his torn feet against the nail, straightened his legs, took a deep breath, and uttered the seventh and last cry. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And to make doubly sure that Jesus really was dead, the legionnaire drove his lance between the ribs, upwards through the pericardium and into the heart. John 19 verse 34 says, and immediately there came out blood and water. Thus there was an escape of watery fluid from the sac surrounding the heart and the blood of the interior of the heart. This is rather conclusive post-mortem evidence. Jesus died. Not the usual crucifixion death of suffocation, but of heart failure due to shock and constriction of the heart. He died of a broken heart. This morning, we take a communion with a reading I only read now and again, so that we can remember. It's by his stripes that we are healed. So let's take our communion cups to hand now, friends. Let's bring them forward and let's take that bread.
Who was